We'd been friends for years, and it was the kind of friendship where you could spend hours together in silence and still have a good time. That's why when Jason suggested camping in a secluded area near an old mining town, I didn't hesitate. The stories we'd heard about the place, whispers of strange occurrences, disappearances, and weird happenings, had intrigued us. Neither of us were the superstitious type, but it was the sort of mystery that seemed impossible to resist. We packed our gear and drove out to the edge of town, where the dirt road leading to the old mining site was barely wide enough for a car. There was a small patch of woods nearby, where the remnants of old mine shafts were scattered through the trees, half hidden under thick brush. We parked the car, grabbed our backpacks, and hiked in as the sun dipped low behind the mountains. The woods were dense, with tall pine trees standing like silent sentinels around us. The air smelled earthy and fresh, but there was something else, an eerie stillness. We found a clearing near a small stream where we set up camp. Jason built a fire while I unpacked the tent. We spent the first evening talking, laughing, and enjoying the crackling warmth of the flames as the dark settled in. There were no sounds of wildlife, no birds calling, no squirrels rustling through the underbrush, just the occasional breeze swaying the branches above us. As night fell, we sat around the fire, sipping our beers and making small talk. Neither of us had any particular reason to feel uneasy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't entirely alone. It was a gut feeling, the kind you can't explain but know deep down. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just my mind running wild. After all, we were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by miles of trees and rugged landscape. We eventually went to bed, the sounds of the crackling fire slowly fading into the background as I drifted into sleep. The night was quiet, the kind of silence that wraps around you like a heavy blanket. But that peace didn't last long. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a faint glow coming through the thin walls of the tent. I rubbed my eyes, still groggy, and blinked a few times. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was the moonlight or the reflection of the fire we'd left burning. But when I sat up and looked out of the tent, I saw it clearly. A faint, pale light glowing in the distance, just past the tree line. Jason was still asleep beside me, his breathing steady and deep. I sat there for a moment, staring at the glow. It wasn't the kind of light that came from a campfire. It wasn't orange or flickering. It was a soft, almost ethereal blue, casting an odd hue over the forest floor. It was impossible to make out exactly what was causing it. The light seemed to pulse slightly, almost as if it were alive. Curiosity got the best of me. I poked Jason awake, whispering his name, but he didn't stir. I nudged him again, harder this time, and he groggily opened his eyes. I pointed to the glow outside the tent, and his brow furrowed. "Do you see that?" I whispered. He rubbed his face, still half asleep. "It's probably just some hikers with a lantern or something." "Doesn't look like a lantern," I replied, my voice barely above a murmur. The light didn't flicker like a flame. It was steady, and it wasn't coming from the direction of the town or any nearby road. Jason sat up now, his curiosity piqued. "You want to check it out?" I nodded. "Let's go." We silently crawled out of the tent, careful not to make too much noise. The night air was cool against my skin, and the forest seemed unnervingly still. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on, shining it briefly in the direction of the glow. The beam barely cut through the darkness, but the strange light ahead of us remained visible, glowing faintly through the trees. We decided to leave our camp gear behind, taking only the flashlight as we made our way toward the source of the light. The ground was uneven, with thick roots twisting beneath our feet. The trees loomed overhead, their branches heavy with dark foliage, casting strange shadows that seemed to shift every time I turned my head. As we got closer, the light grew more distinct. I could see it more clearly now, like a small, glowing sphere hovering just above the ground. It wasn't very bright, but it illuminated the space around it in an unnatural way, as though it were casting a soft, eerie glow on everything within a few feet. Eventually, we reached the clearing where the light was coming from, and that's when we saw it, an old campsite. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. but there was still a fire burning. The embers crackled softly, and the smoke rose in a thin, steady stream into the night air. It wasn't the remnants of a fire, it was fresh, and it looked like someone had just left it behind. I froze. This didn't make any sense. We hadn't seen any signs of other campers when we arrived, and we certainly hadn't heard anything through the night. The nearest road was miles away, and the idea that someone had hiked in this far, set up camp, and then just disappeared didn't sit right with me. Jason stepped forward, his voice low. "That's weird, man." I nodded, still trying to make sense of it. The fire was burning brightly, and there was no sign of anyone nearby. No tents, no gear, just the fire and the faint glow around it. The woods felt heavy with silence, like they were holding their breath. I could hear Jason shifting beside me, and I realized that we both felt the same unease now. Something wasn't right, and every instinct in my body was telling me to turn back. We didn't belong here, and whoever had left the fire burning was long gone. "I think we should go back," I said, my voice steady despite the unease gnawing at my insides. Jason didn't argue. "Yeah, let's get out of here." We turned to leave, and that's when we heard it. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the sound of leaves crunching beneath our boots, but then it repeated, faint but unmistakable. The sound of someone walking behind us, at a distance. I froze mid-step, my heart pounding in my chest. Jason looked at me, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my throat tight. The footsteps kept following us, growing louder as we walked back toward our camp. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw nothing but the darkness of the trees. The footsteps continued, though slow and deliberate, like someone was shadowing us from behind. We quickened our pace, the sounds of the footsteps matching ours, always a few steps behind. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching us. I turned my head once more, but the darkness of the forest revealed nothing. Still, the steps kept coming. When we reached our camp, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The fire we'd left behind was still burning, a steady flame flickering in the silence. We didn't say anything as we scrambled to pack our things, our movements rushed and tense. The footsteps had stopped once we were near the camp, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left. Then came the laughter. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough to make my skin crawl. It sounded like someone laughing softly from deep within the woods, though I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. It wasn't a normal laugh. There was something strange about it, as if the person laughing wasn't quite right in the head. Jason and I didn't say a word, but we both knew what we had to do. We packed up our gear as quickly as possible, not even bothering to put out the fire properly. We just grabbed everything and shoved it into our bags, our movements frantic. By the time we were ready to leave, the laughter had faded, but the tension in the air remained. We didn't look back as we hiked down the trail, trying to keep our footsteps steady as we made our way back to the car. The woods were quiet again, but the silence felt wrong, like something was still lingering just out of sight. When we finally reached the car, I breathed a sigh of relief. Jason didn't speak as we loaded our gear into the trunk, and neither did I. There was no need to say anything. We both knew what we'd experienced, and neither of us wanted to linger in that place any longer than we had to. We drove off in silence, the headlights cutting through the dark, the road ahead stretching out into the night. Neither of us looked back. We never spoke about what happened after that night. Not once. It was one of those things that you can't explain, but you don't need to. We'd both felt it, and that was enough. Sometimes, curiosity can lead you down a path you wish you hadn't taken. And sometimes, it's better not to know what's out there in the dark. We had been hiking the Pacific Northwest for days. Dense, wild forests surrounded us on every side, the kind of place where you feel like you're in a world untouched by time. The trees towered above, their branches reaching out like arms, blocking out most of the sunlight. The air smelled fresh, earthy, like the rain-soaked soil beneath our boots, the kind of place that both calmed and unsettled you all at once. We were a group of 6, all experienced hikers, but none of us had ever spent much time in the deep woods like this. We had heard stories, of course, about the bears, the elk, the unpredictable wildlife, but we all thought we were tough enough to handle anything the forest threw our way. After a long day of hiking through the thick underbrush and over the rough trails, we finally reached our campsite, a small clearing tucked deep into the trees. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink. We got a fire going quickly, the flames crackling in the silence of the forest. The light from the fire cast long shadows that flickered and danced around the clearing, making the trees seem like they were alive, moving and swaying with the breeze. The sound of the fire was the only thing breaking the stillness of the woods. We settled down around the fire, laughing and telling stories, tired but in good spirits. It felt good to be off the trail for a bit, surrounded by friends, the warmth of the fire melting away the day's exhaustion. The forest, however, felt different here. There was a heavy quiet about it, the kind that makes your skin prickle with unease. But we pushed that feeling aside, focusing instead on the comfort of the fire and the conversation. As the night wore on, we slowly started to wind down. The stories became quieter, the laughter less frequent. We leaned back, letting the warmth of the fire soak into our bones. That's when we started to notice something strange. It was subtle at first, almost like a trick of the light. Figures, dark shapes, moving low to the ground between the trees. At first, we thought it was just the shadows playing tricks on us. The firelight flickered, and the shapes seemed to shift, as if the trees themselves were alive, stretching and bending in odd ways. But then we saw them more clearly, moving, crawling between the trees, just out of the firelight's reach. They weren't walking. They were low, almost like animals, but their movements were too deliberate, too human to be animals. They moved in odd jerks, slow and calculated, like they were mimicking some animal's crawl. I tried to make sense of it, but my brain refused to settle on anything concrete. A deer? A bear? But no, they weren't walking, and they were too low to the ground. And the way they moved, the way they seemed to pause and look around, didn't fit anything natural. They felt wrong. I wasn't the only one who noticed. One by one, the others started looking at each other, their eyes wide with confusion. They saw it too, but no one spoke. Not at first. We were all trying to convince ourselves it was nothing, just our tired minds playing tricks on us. But the strange figures kept moving, slowly, always staying just out of the firelight. It felt like they were circling us, creeping in and out of view, making the whole clearing seem smaller, more confined. The air grew thick with tension, and the once comforting sound of the fire became oppressive, its crackling too loud in the quiet. Then we heard it, the faint sound of breathing. Soft at first, barely audible, but unmistakable. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the crackling of the fire. It was breathing, deep, slow, almost like it was coming from all directions. And it wasn't just one. It was multiple, like someone was surrounding us, breathing in time with the rhythm of the forest. The rustling followed soon after, quiet and subtle, but it was there. Not from the trees or the wind, but from the ground, from the brush around us. Something was moving just outside our circle, brushing against the undergrowth, circling closer and closer. A chill ran up my spine, and I could feel my heart start to pound in my chest. We sat frozen, barely moving, straining to hear through the increasing sound of our own breath. The figures, whatever they were, still crawled in the shadows. But now they were closer. I could almost feel them, as though they were closing in, narrowing the space around us. It was then that I realized we had made a mistake. Sitting here by the fire, in the middle of the forest, too far from the trail and too deep into an area known for large wildlife. Bears, elk, cougars, wild creatures that roamed this land, sometimes too close for comfort. But this felt different. This wasn't an animal. These figures didn't move like animals. They weren't even moving like people. It was something else, something wrong. The panic crept in slowly, like a slow-burning fire in my chest. I could see it in the others' faces, too. The tension, the realization that something wasn't right. We were sitting ducks in the middle of the woods, and whatever was out there, crawling, breathing, watching, wasn't going away. I stood up, the noise of the rustling and breathing still coming from all sides. The figures seemed to pause, their movements almost frozen. Then, as if they were waiting for something, they started to move again, circling closer. One of them seemed to get a little too close, just at the edge of the firelight. I could make out the shape of it, a person or something that looked like one, crawling on all fours, its face turned toward us. It wasn't human, though. Its head was too big, too misshapen. Its eyes, if they were eyes, were too large and too dark. It crawled slowly, deliberately, almost like it was testing the limits of our fear. I didn't wait to see more. The others had already started packing up, scrambling to gather what they could, muttering about leaving. The figures in the trees didn't seem to move closer, but they didn't go away either. It was like they were waiting for us to make a move, like they were daring us to stay. We packed in a hurry, each of us trying not to look at the shadows between the trees. The firelight flickered and hissed, casting fleeting shapes on the forest floor. The breathing, still there, had become louder, more distinct. It was as if something was just beyond the edge of our camp, close enough to touch, but still hidden in the darkness. We grabbed our bags, our gear, moving as quietly as possible, not wanting to alert whatever was out there. I was the last to stand, the last to grab my gear, and as I turned to leave, I swore I saw movement in the shadows. A dark figure crawling between the trees. I didn't wait to see if it was real or just another trick of the light. I ran, hurrying to catch up with the others as we headed for the trail, away from the clearing. The sound of the forest around us was overwhelming now. The rustling, the breathing, the crunch of leaves beneath our feet as we hurried through the underbrush. We didn't speak, didn't even look at each other. We just kept moving. The sense of dread followed us all the way to the trail. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of the open path, where we could see the stars above us and the darkness of the forest behind us. We all stopped for a moment, catching our breath, the adrenaline still coursing through our veins. But as we looked back, there was nothing there. No crawling figures, no shadows moving between the trees. It was just the quiet, the night, the forest. But as we packed up the last of our gear, one of us swore they saw something move in the woods, just out of sight. Something tall, something human-shaped, moving through the trees, following us. We looked around, but there was nothing. The woods were still, too still. We didn't stay another minute. We left the clearing behind, the figures, the breathing, the crawling shapes, all of it. We didn't talk about it much after, not for a long time. But I know what I saw. We all did. Something was out there that night, something that made us feel small, powerless. And I don't know what it was, but I'll never forget the way it felt, the way those crawling figures made the forest feel like a trap, and the way it seemed like we weren't the only ones watching. It was one of those nights when everything felt still, almost too still. The kind of quiet that wraps around you like a heavy blanket, making you feel small, insignificant. The sun had long since disappeared behind the distant hills, and the moon barely peeked over the treeline, casting a faint glow on the calm water of the lake. I'd been camping alone for a few days, enjoying the solitude that comes with being out in the middle of nowhere. I had set up my tent by the water's edge earlier that afternoon, just as I had done so many times before. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, and everything about it felt perfect. The lake lay still as glass, reflecting the darkening sky and the surrounding trees. I sat on a rock by the water's edge, watching the ripples dance across the surface as the evening breeze swept through the trees. The air was cool, the smell of pine and damp earth filling my nostrils. There was nothing here to worry about, no distractions, no noise, just the soothing sounds of nature. It was the kind of place that made you feel at ease, as if the world had slowed down for a while, giving you space to breathe. But as the night wore on, something started to feel off. It wasn't anything specific at first, just a growing sense of discomfort that crept up on me, like the world was watching. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. I wasn't scared. I wasn't one to let fear get the best of me. This was supposed to be a getaway, a break from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I crawled into my tent just after dark, rolling out my sleeping bag and trying to settle in for the night. The sounds of the lake, the gentle lapping of water against the shore, and the distant calls of birds were all I could hear. It was the perfect kind of quiet, the kind that you could fall asleep to without a second thought. But as I lay there, drifting in and out of sleep, I began to hear something that didn't belong. It started off so faint that I wasn't sure if I was imagining it. A soft, almost indistinguishable whisper carried on the wind. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of it. It was as if someone was talking in the distance, too far away for me to make out any words. I told myself it was just the wind rustling the leaves, or maybe the water making strange noises as it shifted in the breeze. I closed my eyes, hoping it would pass. But it didn't. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, as if the wind was carrying them directly to me. I could make out a few words now, though they were still unclear. "Get out," the voice seemed to say. It was soft, almost like a hiss, but the words were unmistakable. "Get out." My heart skipped a beat, and I sat up in my tent, my mind racing. I thought maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I had heard the wind or some animal passing by. But the words, they didn't feel right. There was a tension in the air now, a feeling of being watched, like I wasn't alone anymore. I told myself it was nothing, just nerves, just my mind getting the best of me. But deep down, something didn't sit right. I tried to ignore it, hoping it would go away. But it didn't. The whispers came again, louder this time, circling my tent like a storm. "Get out," they repeated, over and over, like a chant. It was almost rhythmic now, the words filling the space around me, moving with the wind as if they were coming from all directions at once. My skin prickled with unease. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and every part of me screamed to leave, but my legs felt like they were frozen to the ground. I had camped alone plenty of times before, and I had never heard anything like this. I shoved myself out of my sleeping bag and quickly zipped the tent open. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the darkness around me. Nothing. The lake lay still, the trees stood silent, and the moon barely pierced the shadows. There was no one out there. I should have felt relief, but all I felt was the weight of the silence pressing in on me. The whispers had stopped, but I still felt them lingering in the air, just beyond my reach. I could almost hear the faintest echo of them, like a soft murmur in the back of my mind. I gathered my things in a panic, trying to shove everything into my pack. The tent, the sleeping bag, my food. It all seemed to be in the way as I fumbled around in the dark. I didn't know why I felt so compelled to leave, but I couldn't stay there anymore. The whispers were gone, but the feeling of being watched was still there, like something unseen was waiting just outside the light of my headlamp. I didn't bother packing everything neatly. I grabbed what I could, zipping up my pack with shaky hands and trying to calm myself down. I forced myself to take deep breaths, telling myself that there was nothing to be afraid of. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to get out of there. Now, the lake, the trees, the entire place, it felt wrong. Something had changed, and I couldn't explain why. The calm I had felt earlier had shifted into something darker, more unsettling. I pulled my pack over my shoulders and stepped out into the night. The air was cold now, colder than it had been when I first arrived. My breath came out in white puffs, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. I didn't even stop to check my surroundings, my eyes fixed on the trail that led away from the lake. The only sound was the crunch of leaves under my boots and the distant, eerie rustling of trees. I kept walking, not looking back, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. By the time I reached the main road, I was out of breath and sweating despite the chill in the air. I didn't care about the trail or where I was going anymore. I just needed to be away from that place. I stood by the road, unsure of what to do next, and pulled out my phone. No signal, of course. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly at myself for thinking I could just leave. There was nowhere to go but back to my car, parked a good mile or so away. It felt like an eternity in the dark, but eventually, I made my way back, my heart still racing in my chest. I don't know how long it took me to reach my car. It felt like hours, like the whole night was stretching on forever. But when I finally got there, I didn't waste any time. I tossed my gear in the back seat, jumped into the driver's seat, and started the engine. I didn't even glance in the rearview mirror as I pulled away from the lake. I couldn't bring myself to. The drive back to the nearest town was long and uneventful. I tried to shake the unease, telling myself it was just a bad night, nothing more. But as I drove, I couldn't stop thinking about the whispers. They weren't just the wind, not just my imagination. Something had been out there with me. Something had made those noises. The next morning, I decided to return to the lake in the daylight. I don't know why I thought it would be any different, but I needed to see it again. I needed to know what I had missed. When I arrived, the sun was high in the sky, and the place looked completely different. The lake shimmered under the bright light, and the trees stood still, unmoving in the heat. The ground was dry, the air smelled of pine and fresh grass. There was nothing eerie about it at all. No sign of anyone else, no strange tracks, no broken branches. Everything was just as it had been when I set up camp the day before. But there was something unsettling about the emptiness. The place felt too quiet, too perfect, like it was waiting for something. I walked around the camp, checking the area where I had set up the tent, but there was no trace of anything. No sign that I had ever been there. It was like the night had never happened. I stood there for a long time, staring at the calm water, trying to make sense of it all. My mind raced with questions, but the answers never came. It was just an empty lake, surrounded by trees. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing but the lingering feeling of being watched, even though I knew no one was there. I didn't stay long. There was nothing left for me there. And as I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I would never come back to this place again. Whatever had happened, whatever I had felt, I didn't want to face it again. There are some things you can't explain, and sometimes it's better that way. I drove away, the whispers still echoing in my mind. The first night in the national forest felt like a dream. The air was crisp and clean, and the only sounds were the whispering of the trees and the occasional ripple of the stream nearby. I remember walking along the trail with Sarah, our backpacks weighing lightly on our shoulders after a few days of hiking. We had been talking about how nice it would be to get away from the hustle and bustle of our daily lives, and here we were, far from everything, just us and nature. We reached our campsite after a few hours of hiking, a secluded little spot by the stream, surrounded by thick woods on all sides. It was a perfect location, quiet and private, the water flowing gently nearby creating a peaceful background noise. Sarah set up the tent while I gathered firewood. The whole evening was just as peaceful as we'd hoped. We built a small fire, shared a quiet meal, and talked under the stars until we both started to doze off, wrapped in the warmth of the fire. That night, the forest was as still as I'd ever experienced. Not a single animal stirred, not even an owl or the distant hoot of a coyote. It was almost too quiet, but after a while, the silence became comforting. We fell asleep quickly, the sounds of the stream lulling us into a deep rest. The next morning, we woke up to a soft, golden light filtering through the trees. The air had a fresh, earthy smell, and the forest was alive with the quiet sounds of the morning. Birds calling, leaves rustling in the light breeze. Sarah got out of the tent first, stretching and rubbing her eyes as she took in the beautiful, calm scene. I followed shortly after, still feeling the fog of sleep in my mind. It wasn't until we were getting ready to make breakfast that I noticed something odd. As I stood by the fire ring, gathering some wood to stoke the fire, I noticed a small trail leading off to the side of our camp, toward a clearing in the woods that I hadn't noticed the night before. I squinted at it for a moment, then turned to Sarah. "Hey," I said, pointing. "Did you see that? There's another campsite over there." Sarah looked up from her packing and followed my gaze. "No, I didn't. Where?" I walked over to the edge of our clearing, stepping through the trees, and there, just beyond the thicket, I saw it, an abandoned campsite. At first, I couldn't make out much, but as I stepped closer, I could clearly see the remnants of a campfire ring, a well-set-up tent, and even a tarp stretched out under a tree. There was no one in sight, but the sight of the site immediately unsettled me. There was something wrong about it, something off. The fire ring had a few charred logs in it, but it didn't look like it had been used for a long time. No ash was fresh. The food left behind, some canned goods and a half-open bag of rice, looked untouched. What was even stranger were the pots and pans left neatly beside the fire, a kettle with a spoon inside, everything in perfect order. It didn't seem like it had been abandoned in a rush, more like someone had just walked off and never returned. I motioned for Sarah to come over, and she joined me, walking slowly, clearly as confused as I was. We both stood there for a few moments, just looking at the campsite, not sure what to make of it. "You think someone's still here?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I replied, "but this doesn't feel right." There were no signs of life. No recent footprints, no tire tracks if there had been a vehicle. The camp had clearly been set up for at least a few days, maybe more, but it felt like it had been abandoned abruptly. The food was still fresh enough that it hadn't been here for weeks, but there was no indication of any human presence. No sign of life, no sounds at all. It was like the place had been deserted, and for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We circled the campsite, poking around, trying to find some clue about who had been there or what had happened. The tent was staked down solidly, the fabric still in good condition, and there were no signs of a struggle. There were no other campsites nearby, just the dense woods. The silence felt heavier here, more suffocating than it had at our camp. We finally decided to leave. Whatever had happened here, it felt like we weren't meant to be part of it. As we packed up our camp and started to break down the tent, we kept glancing back at the strange campsite, wondering if someone was still nearby. We didn't talk much as we hiked out, the feeling of being watched never leaving us. The hike back was uneventful, but something in the air had shifted. Every rustle in the trees, every snap of a twig underfoot, made me feel like someone or something was right behind us. Sarah kept looking over her shoulder, and I could see the unease in her eyes. We kept the pace quick, moving through the woods at a steady clip, but no matter how fast we went, the feeling of being watched stayed with us. The further we walked, the more the silence seemed to press in on us. It was like the forest had become darker somehow, the shadows deeper, the air heavier. Every time I turned around, I half expected to see someone. Maybe the campers from the abandoned site, standing just behind us, watching, waiting. It wasn't until we reached the trailhead that we finally relaxed. The parking lot was still empty, the place just as quiet as when we had arrived. We threw our gear into the car, slammed the doors shut, and drove away without looking back. As we left the forest behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. It wasn't a ghost or anything supernatural. It was something much more primal, something real. I've hiked through the woods plenty of times, but I've never felt the kind of unease I felt that day. It was like something had watched us from the moment we entered the forest, and whatever had happened at that campsite had left its mark on us, too. We never spoke about it again. It wasn't something we could explain, and it wasn't something we wanted to dwell on. But I know one thing for sure, whatever it wasn't just an abandoned campsite. Something had happened there, something that left a feeling, a presence in the air. And whatever it was, I didn't want to go back to find out. It was the kind of camping trip we all needed. After weeks of city life and the constant grind of work and school, we were looking for a break. So, when we decided to get away, we found a place that was so off the beaten path, even our GPS struggled to find it. It was deep in the woods, with no other campsites or hikers around. Just us and the trees, a creek running nearby, and the hum of silence that only a remote forest could provide. We set up camp in a clearing, surrounded by tall, thick pines that seemed to stretch to the sky. The air was fresh and crisp, and the sound of the wind through the trees was soothing. The first night was perfect. We cooked up some hot dogs over the fire, laughed about nothing, and swapped stories. No one had any complaints. It was as if the forest itself had welcomed us, peaceful and serene, like it was ours alone to enjoy. As the evening turned to night, the sky darkened, the only light coming from our campfire and the faint glow of stars. There was no moon that night, and the shadows from the trees seemed to stretch forever. The fire crackled, the smoke drifting lazily up into the cold night air. We crawled into our tents one by one, exhausted from the long hike that day, but content, feeling safe and sound in our little corner of the world. The second night, things started to change. We woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, maybe the branches moving in the breeze, but it was different. More like something moving through the forest, careful but steady. I stayed quiet for a while, unsure whether it was just my mind playing tricks. But then I heard it again. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, crunching the forest floor, followed by the sound of a branch snapping under pressure. I froze, listening. My friends, already half asleep, didn't seem to notice. It sounded like someone was walking around our camp, moving in slow circles, as though they were inspecting us, watching us. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, though the latter seemed unlikely given how quiet the woods were. But still, the footsteps didn't sound like an animal. They were too rhythmic, too deliberate. It was like someone was walking on 2 feet, taking slow steps. The sound came closer. The air felt heavy, as if the forest had stopped breathing. My heart started racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I tried to ignore it, hoping it was just an overactive imagination, but then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A snap of a branch just outside my tent, so close it sounded like it was right next to me. My breath caught in my throat. I lay still, trying to calm my racing heart, listening intently. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then started again, moving past my tent, slow and methodical. Whoever or whatever was out there, they weren't trying to hide. They were moving with purpose, as if they were testing the boundaries of our camp, seeing how close they could get without us noticing. I thought I heard something faint in the distance, maybe a low murmur of voices, but it was hard to tell. I held my breath, trying to listen more closely, but the noise stopped suddenly. A chill crept up my spine. The campfire was still burning, its flickering light casting long shadows on the ground, but now it seemed to fade into the distance, the night swallowing it up. The sound of footsteps seemed to have disappeared entirely. Couldn't sleep. I didn't want to wake the others, not yet. Maybe it was nothing, but the feeling of unease grew stronger, and every little sound seemed louder than it should have been. I lay there, listening to the forest, but the footsteps didn't return. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, we were all groggy but in good spirits. The sun had risen, filtering through the trees, casting long beams of light through the mist that hung in the forest. The air was cool but refreshing. We ate breakfast by the fire, not saying much about the strange sounds from the night before. It didn't feel right to bring it up, not yet. Maybe we had all imagined it. We spent the day exploring. The woods were peaceful, and we didn't see anything out of the ordinary. We hiked along the creek, gathering firewood, and chatted about everything and nothing. The memory of the strange noises the night before slowly faded, pushed to the back of my mind. I convinced myself that it was nothing, just the usual rustling of the forest at night. Maybe a deer had wandered too close, or a raccoon had been scavenging. Either way, there was nothing to worry about. That night, however, the forest felt different. The air was thicker, the shadows deeper. The fire didn't seem to give off as much light as it had the night before, and I felt an unfamiliar tension hanging in the air, like something was just out of reach, watching us. We were all gathered around the campfire, telling stories, when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. In the distance, just beyond the light of the fire, a figure moved. At first, I thought it was just another trick of the shadows, but then it moved again. This time, I could make out the outline of a person. A tall, dark figure that seemed to be standing perfectly still, watching us. It was too far away to be anyone from our group. The movement was slow and deliberate, like someone trying to blend into the shadows, but not doing a very good job of it. I squinted, trying to make out more details, but the darkness swallowed the figure, only the outline of a person visible, just outside the reach of the fire's glow. My heart skipped a beat. I turned to my friends, hoping they saw it too, but none of them had noticed. The figure moved again. This time it seemed to circle the camp, walking just outside the firelight, never coming too close, but never really leaving either. It was like it was pacing, waiting, watching. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe it was an animal, maybe a shadow of the trees, but it didn't move like any animal I had ever seen. It didn't crouch or scurry. It walked like a person, slow and deliberate, and with purpose. Felt wrong. I told the others, and we all stood up, flashlight beams cutting through the dark, scanning the area where we thought we'd seen the figure. The forest was silent, except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. But no one was there. No figure, no movement. Just the blackness of the trees stretching on into the night. We all stood there for a few moments, unsure what to do. We thought maybe someone was playing a prank, but no one from our group had moved, and we all kept our eyes on the fire the whole time. The strange feeling of being watched didn't go away, though. The forest seemed to hold its breath. As the night wore on, we decided to check the camp and see if anything had been disturbed. It was the only logical thing to do. We walked around the tents, checking the area where we thought we had seen the figure, but there was nothing. Nothing but the cold, damp earth beneath our feet and the sound of the wind whispering through the trees. But when we returned to the campfire, we saw something that made our blood run cold. The camp chairs had been moved. The logs near the fire pit were arranged differently, as if someone had been sitting there, rearranging things while we were gone. We hadn't touched the chairs or the logs. We'd been sitting in them all evening. The whole setup was different, as if someone had come into our camp while we weren't paying attention. We packed up our things quickly, the unease growing in the pit of my stomach. There was no explanation for what had happened, no clear answer. We'd all seen something, whether it was a person or something else, but there was no sign of anyone. We didn't stay another night. We didn't want to. The hike back was silent. No one spoke much, each of us lost in our thoughts. We never did figure out who or what had been in the woods with us that night. Was it someone trying to scare us? Or something more unsettling? We never found out. All we knew was that the forest, for all its beauty and tranquility, had become something else that night. It wasn't just a place to camp anymore. It was a place that had watched us, and it was a place that had made us feel small and insignificant. Something had been out there, and it hadn't been an animal. It had been something else entirely. We never went back. The sun had just dipped behind the horizon when Sarah and I arrived at the remote campsite. It was a place we'd found online while trying to get away from the chaos of our everyday lives. The city noise, the crowded streets, the constant buzz of people. It was all too much lately. A weekend in the woods sounded like the perfect way to reset, to just breathe without the weight of the world bearing down on us. We set up our tent near a small creek that trickled through the trees. The campsite was far from any roads or other campers. The only sounds were the rustling of the leaves and the occasional bird call. Felt peaceful, almost surreal. We hadn't been camping in a while, so we spent the evening gathering firewood, setting up our campfire, and preparing a simple dinner of hot dogs and beans. It was the kind of night that made you feel like time slowed down, like the world was still and calm. By the time the fire was low, the night was completely still. The stars overhead were clearer than I'd ever seen them, and we sat in silence, letting the flickering flames cast shadows on our faces. The air was cool, but it felt fresh. There was no sign of anyone else for miles. It was just us and the wild. Sarah leaned back against a log, her head tilted toward the sky, and I could feel her relaxing for the first time in weeks. That first night, everything was perfect. We settled into our tent around midnight, the sounds of the night surrounding us, crickets, distant rustlings, and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was all so familiar, so comforting. We both fell asleep quickly, lulled by the peace. The next morning, I woke up early to the sound of birds chirping. The sun was barely up, casting a soft orange glow through the trees. Sarah was still asleep, so I decided to go for a short walk along the creek. It was still chilly, and the mist from the water curled around the rocks in the early morning light. Everything felt untouched, like no one had set foot here for ages. I took my time, enjoying the solitude. When I returned to the campsite, Sarah was awake, and we ate breakfast together. As the day went on, the campsite remained quiet. No other cars or campers had passed by, and it seemed like we were completely alone. But that night, things started to change. We had just finished dinner when we first heard it, a soft whisper coming from the woods. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but it wasn't quite like that. The sound was too clear, too deliberate. Sarah and I exchanged a look, both of us momentarily freezing. Maybe it's other campers, I suggested, trying to shake off the creeping unease that was slowly spreading through my chest. Sarah nodded, but I could tell she was uncomfortable too. We both went to the edge of the campsite, peering into the dense trees. There was nothing, no signs of movement, no firelight or the crackling of another campfire, just darkness beyond the clearing. I felt a tightness in my stomach as I glanced around again, scanning the trees. The whispering stopped. Probably just some wind, Sarah said, but her voice wasn't as convincing as she'd hoped. We returned to the campfire, trying to brush it off. But that night, the whispers came again, this time clearer, more insistent. I couldn't make out any words, but it felt like someone was just out of sight, calling our names. It was faint, almost like it was carried on the wind, but it was there. Couldn't ignore it, and neither could Sarah. She was tense, her eyes darting around as though expecting someone to emerge from the trees at any moment. It's probably just an animal, I suggested, but even as I said the words, I knew they didn't sound right. The whispers weren't the normal sounds of the forest. We went to bed, our nerves on edge but trying to convince ourselves it was nothing. But sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound, the rustling of the leaves, the snap of a twig, felt amplified in the stillness of the night. I lay awake for what felt like hours, waiting for the whispers to start again. But they didn't. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up suddenly. My eyes snapped open, and for a split second, I had no idea where I was. Then I remembered camping, far from the noise of the city. But something wasn't right. The air felt heavier. The usual night sounds were gone. It was as if the forest had gone completely silent. My heart began to race as I lay still, straining to hear anything at all. And then I heard it again, a whisper, but this time it was unmistakable. It was calling my name, Chris. It was soft but clear. And then, just a few seconds later, it came again. Chris. I froze. My eyes shot to Sarah, who was still asleep beside me. I listened, barely breathing, as the sound came again, this time louder. Chris. I shook Sarah gently, waking her up. Her eyes fluttered open, and I whispered, "Did you hear that?" She nodded slowly, her face pale, and I could see the fear in her eyes. Yeah, I thought it was just me. We lay there in silence for a few more minutes, listening. The whispers continued, now sounding almost like they were circling the tent. They came from different directions, sometimes from the trees on our left, sometimes from the right. I felt my pulse quicken, my skin crawling. The longer I lay there, the more I felt like I was being watched. Then, without warning, our tent shook. It was sudden and violent, as if something large had brushed against it, sending the whole structure rocking. My heart leapt in my chest, and Sarah gasped beside me. I felt my body go rigid, every muscle tensed with fear. Something was outside, something big. My mind raced with possibilities, animals maybe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't normal. We both got up at the same time, our movements jerky and panicked. I grabbed the flashlight, and Sarah zipped open the tent flap cautiously. I held my breath as she slowly peered out into the darkness. There was nothing, just the trees and the moonlight casting long shadows. But then, as the flashlight swept across the tent, I saw it. My blood ran cold. Claw marks, large, deep scratches were gouged into the side of the tent, like something had raked its claws down the fabric. The marks were fresh, the fabric torn, and the earth below was disturbed, as if something heavy had been pacing around. I didn't need to say anything. We both knew it wasn't an animal. No bear, no cougar, nothing we'd ever encountered would leave marks like that. This was something different, something that was trying to get inside. I didn't waste any time. We packed up our gear in a rush, throwing everything into the car without caring about neatness or order. Sarah was already in the passenger seat, her hands trembling as she buckled up. I slammed the car door shut and started the engine, throwing the truck into gear as quickly as I could. As we drove away from the campsite, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The forest behind us looked peaceful, untouched, but I knew better. Whatever had been out there, whatever had been whispering our names and scratching at our tent, was still lurking in those trees, waiting for the next unsuspecting campers to wander in. When we reached the nearest town, we stopped at a gas station to fill up and get our bearings. The clerk behind the counter looked up as I walked in, and his eyes widened when I mentioned the campsite. "You were up there?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded. "Why? People don't camp up there much anymore," he said, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Too many weird things happen up there. Animals, people gone missing, things that don't make sense." My stomach turned. We hadn't been the first to feel something off about that place. As we drove back toward the city, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something in the darkness, but there was nothing, just the road, stretching on into the night. We didn't talk much during the drive. Both of us were too shaken by what had happened, by what we'd experienced, and by the gnawing feeling that we had barely escaped whatever it was that had been watching us. By the time we reached home, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. It took days for me to shake off the feeling of unease. And though I tried to convince myself it was just an animal or some strange coincidence, I couldn't help but wonder, what kind of creature would leave those claw marks? What kind of thing would call out our names in the dead of night? We never went back to that part of the country. In fact, we never went camping again. Some things once seen can't be unseen. We had been talking about going camping for months, but it wasn't until late summer that we finally found the time. A few of us, close friends from high school, wanted to get away from everything and have a weekend deep in the woods, where we could disconnect and enjoy some peace and quiet. We weren't interested in crowded campgrounds or places with a lot of tourists. No, we wanted seclusion, something untouched, where we could be alone with nature. We picked a spot a few hours outside of town, a secluded patch of forest that a friend of ours had been to years ago. He told us it was the perfect place. No one ever went there. No cell service, no rangers, just pure wilderness. It sounded perfect. We left early Friday afternoon, a mix of excitement and anticipation buzzing in the air. Our car was packed with tents, coolers full of food, and enough gear to last us the weekend. There was Alex, my best friend, the most organized of the group, always making sure we had everything we needed. Then there was Sam, always ready for an adventure, even if it was a little dangerous. And Emily, who was more quiet but had a way of keeping us grounded when things went off track. Finally, there was me, nervous but always up for a good time. The drive was long, winding through narrow country roads as we moved farther away from civilization. As the sun began to dip lower, the forest started to close in around us, tall trees stretching high above, blocking out most of the fading light. It felt like we were heading into the heart of nowhere. Eventually, we arrived at the spot, a small clearing just off the dirt road. It wasn't much to look at, just an open space surrounded by thick woods. But something about it felt off right away. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt uneasy as I stepped out of the car. The place was eerily silent, not even a bird chirping. "All right, let's get this camp set up," Alex said, breaking the silence with her usual energy. She started unloading the gear from the car, and the rest of us followed. As we set up our tents and made a fire pit, something caught my eye. Across the clearing, near the edge of the trees, there was an old tent. It wasn't a big one, but it looked like it had been there for a while. The fabric was faded, and it had a sagging corner, But what really stood out was the fact that it was still up. The fire pit next to it was still warm, embers glowing faintly. "Who would leave their tent like this?" Sam asked, walking over to the abandoned shelter. "This looks kind of weird." We all gathered around, inspecting it. The tent didn't look like it had been left behind for long. There were fresh footprints around it, footprints that seemed to lead off into the trees. "Probably someone who left in a hurry," Emily suggested. "Maybe they had to go and didn't want to pack up everything." I agreed, but I still felt uneasy. The whole situation didn't sit right with me. It felt like we had stumbled upon something we weren't supposed to. We decided to ignore it, convincing ourselves it was nothing more than an abandoned campsite. After all, we were out in the middle of nowhere. People probably came here occasionally, maybe even left a bit of their gear behind. We started our own fire, set up our tents, and opened up our cooler. We tried to shake off the strange feeling. The sun set quickly, casting long shadows across the clearing. The fire crackled in the pit, and we gathered around it, cooking hot dogs and making s'mores. The conversation flowed easily as we joked around and laughed, but a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, the air grew colder, and the forest seemed to come alive with the sounds of creaking trees and rustling leaves. The usual nighttime noises, the distant calls of coyotes or the hoot of an owl, were absent. It was so quiet, it almost felt unnatural. I crawled into my tent early, trying to ignore the growing sense of discomfort. I had a hard time falling asleep, the silence weighing heavily on me. Just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it, a faint cry from somewhere in the woods. It was soft, almost like a whimper, barely audible, but unmistakable. I froze. I thought maybe it was a deer or some other animal, but it didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. It almost sounded human. The cry was followed by another, louder this time, a soft, pleading sound that sent a chill down my spine. I held my breath, listening intently. It came from deeper in the woods, beyond the trees. I turned over, trying to ignore it, but it came again, louder this time, like someone in pain. I wanted to call out to my friends, but I was too scared to move. I laid there, staring at the fabric of my tent, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. The cries stopped as suddenly as they had started. The silence returned, even heavier now. I didn't sleep much after that. Every small sound seemed amplified, my mind racing with thoughts of what might be out there. I kept my flashlight close, just in case. Morning came slowly. The sun broke through the trees, casting long golden beams of light across the clearing. The fire pit from the night before was now cold, the embers completely dead. I stepped out of my tent and saw that the forest was eerily quiet, even more so than the night before. As I joined my friends around the campfire, I noticed something strange. There were items scattered near our campsite, small things like broken twigs, pieces of fabric, and bits of trash. It looked like someone had been there during the night, moving around our camp while we were sleeping. The most unsettling thing, though, was the abandoned tent. It was gone. The spot where it had been was now empty, the ground undisturbed. I walked over to the spot where the tent had been, trying to make sense of it. There were no signs of anyone having packed it up. No traces of any kind of struggle or hasty departure. It was like the tent had simply disappeared. The footprints near it were gone too, replaced by a patch of smooth earth. "Where did it go?" Alex asked, noticing it too. "Did we imagine it?" "No, we all saw it," Sam said, scratching his head. "It was right there." We stood there for a few moments, unsure of what to make of it. None of us had any answers. It didn't feel like a prank. It didn't feel like anything we had ever experienced. The cries from the night before and the strange disappearance of the tent were starting to make my skin crawl. We decided to pack up and leave, but as we gathered our things, I couldn't help but feel like we were being watched. It was as though someone or something was lingering just beyond the trees, waiting for us to leave so they could return to whatever they were doing. By the time we had everything packed up, I noticed something else. A faint but unmistakable smell. It was the smell of something rotting, like old meat. It was so faint, I almost thought I imagined it, but then I saw it in Sam's face. He had smelled it too. "Let's go," I said, my voice tight. "I don't want to stick around here anymore." The drive back was long and quiet, none of us speaking much. I think we were all trying to make sense of what had happened, but no one had any answers. We didn't even talk about the cries we'd heard the night before or the missing tent. It felt like we had experienced something we weren't meant to understand, something we weren't supposed to see. It wasn't until a few weeks later, when I was back home and talking to a local ranger, that I got a hint of what had happened. I asked him about the area we had camped in, and he went quiet for a moment. "Not many people go up there," he said, his tone cautious. "But if you ever hear something in the woods that you don't recognize, or if something feels off, just leave. Trust your instincts. Sometimes people go up there, but they don't come back the same." I didn't ask for any more details. I didn't need to know. But now, whenever I think about that weekend, I can't help but wonder if we weren't alone in those woods, and if something was waiting for us to leave so it could finish whatever it had started. I had always loved hiking alone, especially when I found myself in places where the only sounds were my footsteps, the breeze in the trees, and the distant calls of birds. It gave me peace, a kind of quiet that I couldn't find anywhere else. It was just me and the trail, the steady rhythm of my breathing, and the beauty of nature around me. This time, I was heading into a well-known national park, one that had a reputation for incredible views and challenging trails. I'd heard stories from other hikers, most of them tales of incredible scenery and experiences, but something about this place called to me. I was looking for solitude, a break from the noise of daily life, and this park seemed perfect. I had planned my trip carefully. The plan was to spend 3 days out there, camping at a remote site that was accessible only by foot. It wasn't on the main trail, so I knew I wouldn't see many people. That was the point. I wanted to be away from everything. After a few days in the park, I was certain I'd feel refreshed and ready to tackle the world again. The first 2 days went without incident. I'd passed a few other hikers here and there, mostly in the more populated areas near the main trailheads. I'd waved, exchanged the usual pleasantries, but for the most part, I was alone. The weather was perfect, the skies clear, and the air crisp in the morning but warming up nicely as the sun climbed.